Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for tuning in to the TKC Games vlog, blog, whatever you want to call it. As you know, we do some board games. We're working computer software. If you want to find out a bit more about what we do, please go to www.tkc-games.com. Feel free to pick up some product for Christmas. We will have a couple more bundles going live during the week once I work out what I'm going to do, but I think the winter one will be anything to do with Russia's, and so it'll be Hackapali and Barbarossa. We'll do a really good price on that for you. And we've still got our Black Friday offer kicking about, so please pick it up. Everything in print for a very, very reasonable 30% off list. I've only got 3 of those bundles, but I'm sure if you came and had a wee chat with me, I could maybe do something for you if you want something a bit different. So please feel free to ask. Now, in terms of the corporate briefing, which, as you know, I haven't been on Facebook, I think we need to explain a wee bit about why. Number one, after my mum passing, I actually haven't been that well. I had a bit of a meltdown. So getting back to normal, getting some help with that, it's all good, I hope. The net result has actually been, would you believe, quite a bit of progress. So Balkan Fury 2, the usual suspect for a horror story. I've got all my stuff done. I'm just waiting on Martin Potts giving me the rules. So that game's ready to print as far as I'm concerned, but obviously without the rules I can't print it. Madagascar 2 sat in the drawer waiting to go. That's been ready for some time. It's a fairly small task to get that ready for the printers. So when we'll get stock obviously is open to question with the festive season in the way, but we'll do our level best to get something either right before Christmas and start shipping it, or more likely in the new year now. Sorry about that, guys, but at least the game is done. I've also been working really hard on the horror story that is the US Navy in World War II. And as I'm sure you're aware, that impacts upon not just Kamikaze, Watchtower, and I Shall Return, but also impacts upon the reprint of Blitzkrieg, because that's getting extended out to 43 and we need the US Navy there. It impacts on Mare Nostrum. It handles and deals with stuff that's going to be in Liberation in a big way. There's obviously US Navy's in the Med, and it's also in Northwest Europe, operating off of Normandy and so on and so forth. And it's going to impact upon Vengeance, because US Navy ships actually operate up into the Arctic periodically up to about 1943-44. And again, that's something that we do need to show in the games. So without this file, we don't have any product after Balkan Fury 2 that we can reasonably publish. Sorry about that, but that means this is now #1 priority. Everything else is subordinated to getting that done. So where am I at with it? Well, last time we spoke, I think you may recall I was moaning about doing Fletcher class destroyers. Well, not only are the Fletchers done, but the Sumners and the Gearings are done. The Robert Smith destroyer mine layer / destroyer minesweepers, they're done. Every fleet carrier, every light fleet carrier, and every single battleship and battlecruiser that the US Navy had are all dealt with. I'm now working on the escort carriers. I've done about 15 or 20 of them. That will accelerate because all these massive classes of ships, the first, say, 5 to 10, or in the case of the Fletchers, the first 100 out of the 200 or so destroyers, commissioned quite early in the war. That means there's an awful lot of them jumping about doing various interesting things. It's the same with the escort carriers. But as the war progresses and more ships are built, not all of them commission in time to do an awful lot. Many of them just go straight into things like the ferry pool, which we need to create. So the way we're handling that for the Pacific is ferry carriers get dumped into the escort pools. And without those ferry carriers, you're not going to get your replacements, because they're actually how the planes got from, take your pick of a port on the west coast of the US, usually via Pearl Harbor, to take your port of some godforsaken atoll that the Americans had captured and were using as a fleet base. So it could be Eniwetok, it could be Kwajalein, it could be Ulithi, it could be Manus. Any one of those locations were major fleet bases, and obviously that's where an awful lot of these aircraft went to. We're also showing overtly the fleet train. It's the CV support force is what it's going to be in the OB, and that's got a bunch of escorts, and more importantly have a whole bunch of oilers, escort carriers and ammunition ships and so on, which will enable over time, as it gets more sophisticated, the US Navy to replenish its sea and spend a lot of time orbiting off the coast of Japan and bombing the hell out of Japan, which essentially is what happened. So that big chunk of work there involves something like 400 ships that I've dealt with. I've got another 900 or so to go, but to be quite clear, Once you get past the escort carriers, it's then heavy cruisers and light cruisers and AA cruisers. Now, the US Navy has about 70 of them. There's not that many in relation to the Royal Navy, interestingly enough. And again, quite a high percentage are either sunk at the beginning of the war, places like the Battle of Savile Island. Sorry, guys, but it makes my life that wee bit easier because I don't have to track it for 4 years of the war. Or they're new build, so they spend time working up in the East Coast and then they go through the Panama Canal and join up, usually with carrier forces, some of them bombardment group assets. So we'll just have to wait and see how that goes, but it should be fairly quick. When we get into the destroyer escorts, I know from having done them up to October of 1943, for all the factors, 800 or something in that region of those, which is a bit of a nightmare in most people's minds. Please bear in mind they're in blocks of 6 ships. So even though you may only move 2 from one area to another, I usually move the half counter because it makes more sense to do that. It's not a major problem within the game, and we'll be doing something similar, I think, in World War I, where there's an awful lot of very weak torpedo boats and destroyers, in inverted commas, none of which are really going to rate on their own. So Geoff is going to do a wee update about World War I shortly. We'll be doing much the same thing I'm doing, lumping them together into flotillas. We get our rating for the flotilla and then we move halves of the flotilla about. So even if it's only 5 instead of 12 ships that move, we'll move the half because that makes sense. So that's how we're handling that. I'm anticipating that being a fairly quick job once I get past the individual ships, because it was relatively quick the first time I did it. We've already got in other files, which I obviously need to transcribe into this one as required, an awful lot of these support ships that I've mentioned for the US Navy, whether it's fleet oilers, ammunition ships, or submarine tenders, destroyer tenders, amphibious support assets, you know, because some of these we are going to have to show. We actually have a file which includes all of the floating dry docks, and there's quite a few of them. Now, you need those to create the ability to refit ships at locations ranging from Espiritu Santo through Afate, up through Tulagi, then into Hollandia, and so on and so forth. So I think you're getting the idea there's quite a lot of them. It should be noted that they very rarely were moved. So these things actually tended to stay wherever they were installed. So there's a constant need to build more, and as they arrive, you get to build fleet bases at these remote atolls and ports and so on around New Guinea and wherever else. So that is how we're going to handle that. I can tell you a little bit more in depth about how we're handling some of the engineer assets, which caused a huge delay with Watchtower. Not many people realise this, and certainly we got it wrong. We've got all the various standard sources in the US Army and the US Marines. I've got them, Corey's got them, we've ploughed through them jointly years ago to try and put stuff together. Matthew, his son, did a lot of that work, and we thought we actually had a handle on all the engineers. It turned out we didn't. There's somewhere between 3,000 and 6,000 battalions of engineers that we didn't know anything about. Corey found that thanks to assorted websites that talk about US engineering assets, and at some point I'll get some links and I'll get them put into the description of one of these videos so you guys can go and take a look. A huge number of these things literally do nothing in game terms, right? They're just repairing potholes and roads once the roads have been built. So we're interested in the people who created the bases in the first place, because those are the assets you can move forward to support your ongoing operation. These other things we're going to show essentially as the headquarters. They'll be 0 rated, and you're going to absorb them into base areas. And those base areas are then how you locate your floating warehouses. That's some naval shipping points for those of you who don't realise that's actually how they had to do it. That's where you're going to take your floating dry docks, your submarine tender, your destroyer tender, your flying boat tender, etc., to create a naval base. Assets like the CBs, I think there's about 700 or 800 battalions of CBs. We track them individually. Where there is, I think there are some regimental HQs. I need to go look at the file to confirm that. They'll probably be shown as regiments just to limit counter count. That again will help you build your naval bases. So that's a really important point. We also have introduced for Watchtower, and I want to talk about this a little bit more in another video, various other things. One of them's, as it were, a coastal QM unit, and that represents the Japanese Rat Run. where they used Daihatsu barges. Most Westerners think of them as landing craft, but most of them didn't have a dropping front ramp. They were essentially the cheapest possible way to make a wood boat that could carry 10 tons of supplies along the coastline. These things, they built several million tons of them. It's an enormous number. We have books that refer to them in quite considerable and very tedious detail. And it turns out that pretty much every Japanese ship that left the home islands from 1942 onwards were festooned with these things. And it'd be unloaded somewhere in a forward area, and they start to create, they called it the Rat Run, essentially a low-level supply network. So we're going to show that in the games. We also know that the US Navy spent a huge amount of resources with destroyer escorts and fleet destroyers and PT boats and God knows what else, trying to disrupt that flow of supply. That was an absolute bust, because you shove a 5-inch shell through one of these things, the shell doesn't notice it's there, but it does sink it, usually tied up along the coast. Took the Japanese a couple of hours to nail some wood and then just bail the thing out and get it back to sea. Now, not all the supplies obviously would survive, but if it's something that's in a waterproof container like petrol or whatever, it would actually get there. And ammunition surprisingly resilient to getting soaked. So the bottom line is there are new things that are coming with Watchtower that I'm hoping will get rid of the need for any additional rules for the Second World War game series. Now, I have started work myself on the First World War rules, mostly just deleting stuff from TSWW that we don't need. Ships don't have radar. Ships don't generally have float planes to begin with. They may do towards the end of the war. Geoff will probably be able to tell you a bit more about that in some other video, and he's saying maybe, maybe not. But the reality of it is the same rule set is going to be adapted. Right? We're not going to be creating a new set of rules, so we're a lot closer there than we could be. And I'm really sorry, we had hoped to have artwork done by this point, or at least underway by this point, for TFWW, but unfortunately with me not being well and various other family problems I've had to deal with, there's not a great deal that can be done till probably New Year with this, because Geoff has not had the guidance he'd hoped for. My problem. So Geoff, where are we at with your work in TFWW right now?
Right. A few more weeks and I shall have the British and the Germans in a nice state of completion. So what I've been doing recently, I was going through the I basically got it up to the dreadnoughts for the British. I need to just get on with those, start those tomorrow morning. So what I've been doing for that is just cleaning up a few things here and there that have been on my mind for the past 3 years. I've been through the pre-dreads and the armoured cruisers where they get their guns shifted up from the lower deck, where bad sea conditions will make them impossible to use up the upper deck. Basically, no one really knows when that happened. So what I'm going to do is them 2 or 3 where I've managed to isolate where that would occur. A refit in Simonstown, where it's the only possible place it could have happened, because the rest of the year they're sailing around the whatever sea. But other than that, I'll just say to the players, guys, just choose when you want to have the ship upgraded. It should be upgraded by this point in the OB, and put it in the dock, and then take it out again. There you go. Happy birthday. So get that sorted. After that, I will get British mine warfare done. That's another funny thing where the British just don't seem to care about chronicling where some of their most important mine warfare ships were stationed, but I've managed to cobble together stuff, get that done in the afternoon, hopefully. And then sort out, I've got 4 German cruisers where even the Germans don't know when they were laid down. It doesn't say in here, the Deutschen Kriegsschiff, very good book. It doesn't say in here, Gröne, very, very good book. And it doesn't say Navypedia, so I'm going to take a big guess. There are just enough German cruisers where I can really quickly go through, calculate an average, put it in. It's just 4 ships, and the rest of their life in the war is they go in a German bite pool and you forget about them. Other than that, German dreadnoughts, get them done. And then fun stuff, what if scenarios, battles. Did you know that Admiral Scheer was vaguely aware of Operation Hush? The British planned to land on a certain part of the Belgian coast, I think, and they had these great pontoons which would carry a division, huge, huge barges that the monitors would be towing to their target.
Wow.
And Scheer was thinking about intercepting that. So stuff like that. So next few weeks, just grind through it, get it done. I admit I've had to be delayed quite a bit as well due to other stuff. So get this out of the way, and then it's American Individual Destroyers. And then the new year, we can sort out that annoying group of people known as the French Navy. And that's that. Happy birthday.
Happy birthday to you there. If it helps, Black Prince, the armoured cruiser, had her guns moved from the waterline up onto the upper deck in March of 1960. A refit. So there is some data.
That's the only one. Yeah, that's the only precise one I've got, and I've pinpointed it to. I can't remember where. Let me have a look. I've got it right here, actually. I did it approximately 30 minutes ago. She hasn't moved. Come on, Black Prince. Oh, right. It's not in the navalhistory.net logs. Duke of Edinburgh has it moved up May 17. It's got to be a Liverpool refit, 5117. So Black Prince 1916, no idea. So that's up to the player. They can have fun.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, if there's a refit that fits in with, particularly if it's a little bit more extended, my suspicion is changes would happen then. I've got much the same problem with some of the US Navy ships that, for those of you who haven't used the Dictionary of American Naval Fighting Ships, it's the only reasonable resource. Wiki is actually better than it because people have plugged more information in, very often from the Ship Society websites and so on and so forth. But it's very rare that anything really tells me in any great detail when an AA fit was amended or the float plane was maybe taken off a cruiser or whatever in the US Navy. Now, to be fair, the US tended to retain its float planes right to the end of the war because they weren't engaging in that many surface combats, whereas the Royal Navy, the Italians and the Germans tended to get rid of float planes wherever possible, because if you get hit by a 6-inch or a 15-inch shell and the thing in its petrol store goes bang, your ship tends to go bang with it. Now, in the Pacific, where there's huge distances, having a float plane is very handy to go look at stuff. So from a spotting perspective, that's an important thing from a surface combat sort of point of view, but also when you're the US Navy doing amphibious assault after amphibious assault, the ability to direct your gunfire is really, really important. And that's not something that's as important, say, in Europe, because you've got a limited number of these things. You've obviously got Torch, and then you've got the Sicily, and then you've got the 3 or 4 landings into Italy, including obviously Salerno and Anzio, but you've got Taranto and various other things like that done in the Straits of Messina, which essentially was a glorified river crossing. And then, of course, you've got stuff into Corsica and Sardinia, but again, they're fairly limited. You've got Normandy itself, you've got, and that's a special case actually, which we'll briefly touch on, might be interesting for those of you who don't know this. The Royal Navy and its fleet air arm assets, which were on these ships, those few ships that still had float planes, those float planes were taken away. The aircrew were given Seafires or Spitfires and were trained to operate as forward reservists flying them. And it turns out, because I found this out when looking at some of the battleships for the US Navy, the US Navy battleships had the same thing done. The decision was taken to get rid of their onboard float planes and use the aircrew flying British Spitfires. I find that quite interesting. I'm really surprised it wasn't like a late model P-51 or something, because it's got more loiter time, but there you have it. And the reason for that was it was anticipated that the Germans would throw many more aircraft in Meath than actually occurred. And so you're aware, I think I've mentioned before in these things, the Luftwaffe had transferred a huge chunk of its firepower and then pumped in a massive amount of new production to try and keep air units in combat. It lost between 3,000 and 5,000 planes during the Battle of Normandy and the breakout. So we're not talking about a small response. So survivability was seen as more important possibly than loiter time. And the Spitfire obviously was available in large numbers in the UK and was quite survivable. So that is why they did that. It's very unusual. So I feel Geoff's pain with all this refit nonsense, because it can be a real bind. And even if you go through Navypedia in depth, you might well get told that for a Fletcher class destroyer, just for the sake of argument, a refit is done sometime in 1943. We don't know when. And even when you go through the text of Danfoss and you find out the ship maybe went to San Francisco, it might do it twice in a year. Possibly one of those 2 times is the modification. The other one is because it's had a problem with the propulsion system or maybe been hit by a bomb or whatever. So there are issues surrounding refits. We do the best we can. We believe we've got the best information out there for the games. But if any of you actually have a huge amount of information about this, if it's your hobby or whatever, and you want to share it with us, please feel free to use our info@tkc-games.com email address and pop us a line, because I can forward that to Geoff if it's about World War I, or I can look at it in terms of World War II and see if there's something we can do to improve what we're doing. That obviously would be quite useful.
One thing I'd say, if anyone has any information on when depth charges are fitted to certain destroyer groups, go ahead. Because basically what I'm going to do is you have certain destroyer groups that move down from the Grand Fleet to Devonport, what have you, 1916, 1917. And I'm treating that movement as when they get the depth charges. The first depth charge, I think, was it Dunraven 1915? I probably got that wrong. But by this point, it's just a canister with a simple pistol, and when the pressure gets enough. So it's relatively easy to equip them. I'm thinking maybe have a modifier instead of anything on the counter. Just say that's when they get more effective at hitting submarines. When you look at damage table rolls or something, very quick blank upgrade. So you start out with two depth charges literally rolled off the back of the deck. Then you get depth charges and drop collars. Then you start to move to the 30 depth charges per ship with the Y guns, the Thornycroft throwers, and the rails. So yeah, if anyone has any info on that, I'd be very happy to use it. But yeah, and anything on mine warfare ships, we know where the Princess Margaret is throughout the war. That would probably enable me to track the entire mine warfare squadron. But for the moment, I've got every 6 months, I've got certain things I can piece together. I might get someone to have a look at a log in National Archives, but that's stupidly pricey, and they're not always reliable anyway. It's fascinating. You occasionally find people writing in a log, and they don't actually say where the ship is. They sort of assume, oh, everyone will know. My commanding officer will know where the ship is. I'm going to say when we talk on water. It's really fun when they do that. But yeah, any information, that's cool.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, that's why I don't worry so much about some of that access stuff, because for the purpose of the games with a half-month game turn, we need to know roughly where the ship is. It only gets really awkward if something rapid is happening. I can't comment too much about World War I because that's Geoff's bailiwick, but in World War II, the hunt for Bismarck, that's chaotic for a couple of game turns, and I know it is, because the Royal Navy basically sends every ship they can get to sea to find and sink her. The setup for the raid on Taranto and the fallout from it, that's also chaos, because you have ships stealing flat out from the UK into the Med to reinforce the Mediterranean fleet, particularly the cruiser forces, because the cruisers had just taken a couple of losses from torpedoes or whatever prior to that, so they needed ships there to cover the carrier. That kind of stuff, that does create certainly complexity. Anything to do with Arctic convoys or Mediterranean convoys to Malta can be really confusing and very difficult to handle in a game. Those of you who've got Barbarossa and haven't looked at the Allied OB, the Western Allied OB in that, please do, because you'll see you'll understand the problem. And that's taken from effectively the Bible, which, if I could lay my hands on it and show you the little book, it's not a very big book, and it's written by a guy who actually fought in those Arctic convoys. And it handles all the ship movements, and as far as we're aware, it's accurate. There are a few discrepancies wherever possible. I've gone with the book. A couple of them, it's that ship was sunk, so it can't possibly be there. So the guy's got it wrong. What it probably is a ship with a similar sounding name, and if it's an I-class destroyer, it could be something, just another I-class is there. But you get the general idea that we are very careful with this wherever possible. But when push comes to shove, a ship steaming at 20 knots for 15 days, it's essentially gone about halfway around the world. That's one of the things people don't realise, is that in relation to ground combat, naval combat is instantaneous. And of course, air-to-air combat is a fraction of instantaneous. It's just a blip. And when we're doing these half-month turns, we're actually looking at multiple strikes by aircraft, We're looking at spot combats, which are transient. That's why we call them transit combats. It's not something, you know, you don't have a gunnery battle for 2 weeks between battleships. It's usually an hour or two, maybe 3 or 4 at most. And even naval gunfire support for assault landings, yes, the ship might be hanging about off the coast for a few days, but it's actually going to go away and powder its nose. And you read about that, you know, powdering its nose could just be refueling, it could be remunitioning. My understanding is certain things can be remunitioned at sea and not everything can. Certainly with modern ships with fancy missile systems and VLS and so on, use it and you've lost it. You know, if you've got an Aegis cruiser or a Type 42 destroyer or whatever, if it shoots out its air defence missile load, you're back to whatever 40mm and 20mm cannon and Gatling guns and whatever else it's got on board. And it's 5-inch or 4.5-inch. That's it. You ain't got no missiles, guys. You've used them. You can't replenish them at sea. And this is one of the things that people maybe don't realise, that even with the US carrier battle groups and their massive amphibious support behind them, there's only so much ammunition that can be shifted, and it tended to be AA stuff because that's what the US Navy was firing through at a massive rate, obviously trying to fend off kamikaze attacks and whatever else. So these are just things we are looking at as a company. We're trying to get a handle on it. I will hopefully be seeing Geoff up here in Scotland maybe in February. He and I will have a chat about that after the new year and set something up. And at that point there will be INTAT work. I should have mapping either done or very close to done for TFWW in the West. We know the area we're going to map. I think we've showed that before on one of these videos. Please go through them. I'm sure it'll be in the comments. But that really is where we're at in terms of the board games. So here's hoping that I can continue getting a good run, as can Geoff, and you know, he and I can have chats every now and then through the weeks as things move forward. Obviously, the festive season, that's going to get in the way, but I will be working certain days through that. Normally I don't. It's usually the only 2 weeks of the year I take off, but this year you know, I've not been here as much as I should have been because of family problems and mum and whatnot. So I think the solution will be to try and do a bit of catch up and downtime over the festive season. And that brings us on to the other big project we've got, which is software. I had a long chat with Bob beginning of the week. Bob essentially has been doing a shed load of programming, and what he's been doing is not the sort of exciting stuff you'd probably want to hear, which is, hey, a new rule's been implemented, or we've fixed a problem with the air system or whatever. What he's actually been doing is dragging the code out of 10-year-old hiatus. That was the deletion of about 6,000 lines of crap, which we don't need. He then deleted almost 4,800 lines, I think 4777 is the number, of code which was not defunct, but was actually so old-fashioned it was a potential risk to the quality of the code and security. And he's replaced that with about 5,000 new lines of code, which has also tidied up some of that 6,000 lines of dead stuff that we didn't need because it had no real bearing on the game, right? Some of that's legacy code, some of that I believe was stuff to do with the way libraries worked back in the day. Some of it was a windowing tool which I believe he's taken out to some extent, and so on and so forth. Now all of that takes a lot of time. That's taken him about 5 working days to get that done. I know that he's started giving me stuff in the devlog that we've got saying, look, I've fixed this, I've fixed that. I've got a new installer, for example, which is in the back of all that work. And I believe that installer actually works, whereas when he gave me it the other day, it didn't. And he had to go bug fix that as a priority. So Bob's been really busy doing various interesting things, but not the sort of stuff that he really wants to be doing. And he's a bit annoyed with it, but it needs to be done. Andrew's supposedly doing some formatting. I've tried to find out if he has, so maybe Andrew can put a note down below saying whether or not it has been. So Bob needs that so you can suck data in to update games. And once we get that working, guys, it actually means that we can then take our existing Word files, which generate the PDF files that you all have in the board games, and we can actually suck the data out and drop that pretty much straight into the game code. So as long as we get the right map, and that's the key thing, because there's stuff we do in the map editor to play with what is in the background of the computer game. as long as we get the right map, it's set up right, we can then suck that data in and bang, we then have pretty much every single at start that we've published to date. Now that obviously ties in quite nicely to a launch of the software code when we get to that point, with a whole bunch of DLC that you can buy, as well as the main game with a couple of scenarios and maybe one of the major games already in it. That's a really exciting development for us. Once we get that moving, we will have Bob back on here to have a little chat with you, but I don't see much point in wasting his time and your time with that until he's got something more to say. So that's where we're at with the software project. Lots of work in the background. Lots of stuff that we need to do that I'm hoping will develop a really high quality product. It certainly looks pretty cool. I know that we now have a very tight scheduling system in place in this. I found some 60 or 80, we call them bugs, but they aren't all bugs. Some of them are bits that just don't work. Some are bits I don't understand how it's working, and we need to look at that. And we've got stuff where, simply put, it just doesn't do it. So to get us to the vertical slice so we can get the publication of this squared away and straightened out, we obviously need to fix all of that. We need to get stuff that isn't currently working. And some of that's going to take a bit of logic engine work. And that's something that we need to look at. One of my plans there is to try and get Bob and Martin in a room together so they get to know each other and start to communicate properly. That'd be really powerful because it means I can essentially push them to one side and say, get on with that. And I don't have to interfere with the hard work that they're doing. And that doesn't interfere as much with the hard work that I'm going to be doing to get Watchtower put together and to move I Shall Return out the door. Which reminds me, Dennis and I have had a couple of phone conversations in the last month about I Shall Return. Pretty much it's done, as far as I'm concerned. As far as he's concerned, he still has to faff around with various things, but I understand why he's doing it. Because he's also wanting to publish his own game. And I'm going to give him a wee plug here. He wants to do the Philippines pretty much through the war, effectively at company scale. Now, I'm not too interested in publishing that myself because it sounds like a horror story to me, and I think it'd be really tough to play. I've had a look at the rules. They're very well put together, but they're super detailed. If you're into Advanced Squad Leader, this will blow that out of the water. I'm here to tell you, it's absolutely incredible, and he can map it at that scale. That's what he wants to do with it. So our work's in the back of that. And he has told me that until he gets the US Navy from me, he can't release the files fully. So I Shall Return, you're all aware because I've said it repeatedly, we have a contract with Dennis that as soon as we get that complete, I have to publish. Right, I have no option. So at some point over the festive season, I am going to revisit the Philippines mapping and try and drive that forward so I can get him draft maps. That'd be really useful for him, also for me, because that gets that monkey off my back. Geoff and I did previous work in the China incident. At some point he and I'll have a chat, then we'll do a video about that and see what we have to do. And look at Geoff's face. He's trying to find a rope and a very tall lamppost. Please don't, Geoff, we need you. You're a nice guy, we don't lose you. And with that, I'm pretty much done. Geoff, do you want to chat about anything before we get off of this?
Oh, one thing actually, that logo behind you, that bear and that eagle. When doing the German Navy in the Baltic, I built up. I've already got a very fairly reasonable understanding of where the German Navy is in the Baltic. So long as the Russians on Wikipedia are vaguely useful, and to be very clear, Wikipedia is wonderful for translating stuff that isn't available in the Anglophone-speaking world. So long as the Russian stuff there is reasonable, the only navies I anticipate having any problems with for any naval theatre of the war from here on should be the Italians and the French. And hopefully I could even be relatively secure with the French, to be honest. So, yeah, we've basically got the naval side, half of the naval side of the Bear and the Eagle, not in the bag, but we're definitely 50% there. There you go.
I'm just taking a quick look at the Poltava, which is some form of a dreadnought battleship. There is a bit of information, but not a huge amount. My suspicion that we're going to find is that, yeah, well, this one basically does trials 1915, presumably commissioned, commissioned January 1915 in game terms. It's actually the 30th of December 14. She was part of the February Revolution. Mm-hmm. She did nothing else. So
a lot of records. Oh, sorry, you go.
Yeah, so from I recall of doing the Red Navy, and bear in mind a lot of these World War I Russian ships, particularly the destroyers, there are holdouts that survived to World War II. The Novik class are recognised, the Orpheus and so on, the Fidoneses, they're essentially just all developed to the same sort of 3 or 4 stack type destroyers. But there's quite a lot of information about what these things did floating about if you go digging, and I think there may be a couple of websites about the Red Navy that I can try and find and see if there's an equivalent stuff for the Imperial Navy that would actually handle a lot of the smaller scale stuff that probably happened in the Baltic that I have no idea about, which might be useful. So yeah, this is one of those ones where I'm aware that between Wiki and various other websites we will get stuff. Part of the problem you're always going to have with this is that it's not an area where archival sources are easily available. So there are very few books, particularly in English. I do have a couple of contacts inside Russia. The issue we're going to have is, unfortunately, with the Ukraine mess, I understand there's problems. Let's just leave it at that. I know one of my clients, I just can't get hold of him. I also know that he does something fairly high-powered in the Russian military, but that guy, he's the man I'd go to for information because I know he can get access to the archive. He's helped us with Barbarossa and Vengeance OBs quite dramatically. If we can't get him, sorry guys, we're going to have to do the best we can. But the key thing is, it's not as if there's a Jutland per se in the Baltic. There's some fairly big naval engagements, but they will be documented. You know, so I'm not hugely concerned about this as long as we know where they are based. And it might just be that we have an indication that they move from, you know, I don't know, from St. Petersburg or Peterburg as it became into, from Petrograd rather, maybe forward to Tallinn or to Helsinki or whatever. If that's the case, then that's all we have, then that's what you get as the player. And it's up to you to use those ships. We'll probably put in some victory and utilization rules because I'm aware that an awful lot of what the Imperial Russian fleet did and then the Soviet fleet did in the Baltic in particular was just try and protect Petrograd/Leningrad. It didn't do an awful lot more. A lot of that was done through mine barrages and so on and so forth, of course, particularly in War II with Leningrad encircled and cut off. But the reality of it is that we will give you the best information we can find. That doesn't mean you're going to get rubbish, by the way, guys. But where we don't know, we're going to be pretty honest about it. Those of you who've followed me for years and bought my games for years will know categorically that sometimes I'll just say, I don't know, please help. And sometimes I get information, sometimes I don't. I got some handy book references for the fiasco in the Balkans. That was one of the things that slowed that down, was trying to get a handle on the partisans. Obviously, that is a key part of that campaign game. But in reality, you really get 2 sets of victory conditions. You've got the, you know, up to the German intervention and the outcome from that. Then you've got what happens to the partisans. It's 2 very different wars. So you've got essentially 2 different VCs there. What we've got with World War I will be very similar. Some of it will be big war on the Western Front, the Eastern Front, massive armies slaughtering each other, the odd major naval engagement, and quite a lot of smaller tip and run stuff I know from having spoken with Geoff. And we're going to always put in little requests. So again, anything to do with depth charges and destroyers, always handy for Geoff to get some idea there. That's useful, by the way, from a game perspective, because we need to show some kind of anti-submarine capability. And getting hydrophones and depth charges is a massive step up from jack shit. Right? If you get nothing, you get nothing. Right? And it's a bit like the Italian Navy getting sonar on some of its destroyers in World War II and destroyer escorts. It takes it from essentially, I won't say valueless, but a really limited ESW platform to something that's quite capable. And it's noticeable that British submarine losses increase rapidly when that happens. Because with hydrophones, the boats could go quiet and it would be unlikely that the Italians could detect them. But later on with sonar, they could go hunting for them and actually find them and attack them. And we all know the more you hit or fire at something, the more chance there is you getting lucky and killing it. So, you know, the same thing happens to the Americans in the Pacific as the Japanese get wise to it and start to put effectively sonar on some of their ships. But if you look at the games, we'd have rules that say virtually no ASW capability here, and that's going to be even more prevalent in World War I till these things get plugged in. So the more information we have, the more accurate that rule becomes. It may be that we track it ship by ship if we've got that data. The odds are we don't. So we're going to have to probably do a time frame graduation, and so X percentage of ships get them through refit at this point and Y through that point and so on. I don't know what Geoff thinks of that idea. He and I can have an argument on the phone about it. That seems to me to be a fair solution if we're stuck. Yeah?
Yeah.
It's a bit of a bugger, but effectively we've got a lot of information. We need to do some transcribing. We need to do some typing, basically, to get all these OBs put together into a format you guys can use. But it's coming together, guys. I'm really excited about War One. I never thought it would be, because to me it's not really the most exciting thing till you start reading, particularly about some of the stuff that goes around the fringe of it and how that impacts on the grand scheme of things. And we have some really nasty, clever ideas. We all like nasty, clever ideas in board games, which will hopefully, you know, drive you to do things that common sense would prevail against normally. You know,
the Germans actually have a navy in this one. You know,
it's
not much.
Unlike World War II, guys, it doesn't end up in the bottom of the Norwegian Sea in 1940. Okay, so it doesn't all die in 1914. There's a whole shitload of it at the end of the war. All right, and you can probably have some fun with it if you really want to. And that's something we need to. Geoff and I will have a chat about, and we'll come back to you with some video on that. So, thank you all for watching, guys. I'm going to draw it fairly short today. Don't know when Andrew will get this video up, but it will be in the usual places on Facebook and through the website and also through YouTube. So if you like it, down there, like it. If you don't like it, tell us. If you want to comment, get into discussion, feel free. And if you've got any information you think would be useful, info@tkc-games.com. We're back to selling board games, so if you want some games, take a look at what we've got. We're in a sale at the moment. That sale's going to run into January. That's a little thank you for all your support while things have been going pretty badly for me this year. It's really, really appreciated, and all the sympathy and the outpouring of support has been gratifying. We will be updating more frequently. I should be on Facebook in the next few days. I was hoping to do it today, but that went by the board, unfortunately, because of other commitments. But over the next few days, we'll be doing some written updates. The big one, hopefully, will be, hey, we've sent files to printers. Can't wait to get that monkey off my back. Have a good one. Take care. Good night. Bye-bye.